the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
Banks create new money whenever they extend credit, buy existing assets, or make payments on their own account, which mostly involves expanding their assets. When a bank buys securities, such as a corporate or government bond, it adds the bond to its assets and increases the company's bank deposits by the corresponding amount. New commercial bank money enters circulation when people spend the credit that has been granted to them by banks.
I found that talking on the doorstep from August last year round to August 2009 round to the general election, 9 months I suppose, knocking on doors, is that when you try to explain how the money system works, there's an almost inbuilt refusal of people to accept that such a bizarre situation could actually exist. No, it can't possibly. What do you mean? It can't. Banks don't create money out of thin air. That's ridiculous. They can't do that. They lend out their depositors' money. Most people have an idea of how money is. They're used to their own way of handling money. And they try and implement their own idea of how their small household economy works into the national economy. And of course it just doesn't work out. It just doesn't work out at all.
By 2008, the outstanding loan portfolio of bank-created credit, also known as commercial bank money, stood at over £2 trillion. As recently as 1982, the ratio of notes and coins to bank deposits was 1 to 12. By 2010, the ratio had risen to 1 to 37. That is, for every pound of Treasury-created money, there was £37 of bank-created money. In the 10 years prior to the 2007 crisis, the UK commercial bank money supply expanded by between 7 to 10% every year. A growth rate of 7% is the equivalent of doubling the money supply every 10 years.
The amount of money they're creating out of nothing is just incredible. 1.2 trillion in the last 10 years. And that money is being distributed according to the priorities of the banking sector, not the priorities of society.
Bank sector itself grew from 1980, $2.5 trillion to $40 trillion by assets. In 1980, global bank assets were worth 20 times the then global economy. By 2006, they were worth 75 times, according to the UN.
As the following chart shows, total bank assets of UK banks as a percentage of GDP remain relatively stable at 50 to 60% up to the end of the 1960s. After that, they shot up dramatically.
And the real money in the world to be made today is not by producing anything at all. It's simply by forms of speculating, basically making money from money. That's the most profitable and by far and away the biggest form of activity, of economic activity that exists in the world today.
Today, banks are no longer restricted by how much they can lend, and as such, how much new credit they can create out of nothing. They are restricted solely by their own willingness to lend.
The issue with allowing banks to create money, there's two main issues. Firstly, the fact that they create this money when they make loans. So it guarantees that we have to borrow all our money for the economy from the banks.
As such, to have a healthy growing economy, the government needs to put in place strategies to allow for ever-increasing debt.
The only way the government can create additional purchasing power is by getting itself and us into more debt.
The second big issue with allowing banks to create money is that they have the incentive to always create more. They create more money if they issue a loan. They get the bonuses and the commissions and the incentives to create, to lend as much as possible.
You have to develop a sales culture. What did they do? They recruited an amazing guy, lovely guy, Andy Hornby, who came from Asda, to turn the bank into a supermarket retailing operation.
If you trust bankers to control the money supply will just grow and grow and grow, as will the level of debt, until the point where it crashes, when some people can't repay the debt, and then they'll stop lending. You hear politicians and journalists saying, we've been living beyond our means, we've become dependent on debt, we need to rein in our spending and live within our means. It's not possible in the current system. The reason why everybody's in debt now is not because they've been recklessly borrowing. We haven't borrowed all this money from an army of pensioners who've been saving up their whole lives. Money in the current system is debt. It's created when banks make loans. So the only way in the current system that we can have any money in the economy, the only way we can have money for business to trade, is if we've borrowed it all from the banks.
And it's the very opposite of what the Tory party is arguing today, which is that you have to create savings before you can help the National Health Service. And it's because economists have completely confused those things, both in monetary policy terms, but also in economic thinking, and because most people still harbour the old-fashioned view that you need savings before you can invest, that we have the mess that we're in today. Now, one of the reasons why we find it difficult to understand the banking system and credit creation is that we leave school without any money, and we go and get a job working as an apprentice to a plumber. We work really hard all month, and at the end of the month, somebody puts money in our bank. And so for us, the logic is you work and then you get money, you get savings. In reality, you would never have got that job if credit hadn't been created in the first instance. It's a really important conceptual misunderstanding, and it isn't something that the public just are guilty of. Economists don't understand this stuff.
Money doesn't come out of economic activity. A lot of people I've come across as kind of assume that if you've got businesses and you've got people doing things, that somehow money somehow emerges out of the process of people doing things, making things and growing things and selling things and producing things, that somehow money just emerges. It's not. It's like oil in a car. You have to put it in.
When I see David Cameron talking about how we need an economy not based on debt, but we need an economy based on savings, he just doesn't know what he's saying. It's ridiculous, it's absolutely absurd, and it shows his complete lack of understanding of how our money system actually works. What he's essentially saying is that we need an economy with no money. If everyone was saving, we'd have mass disappearing of money, which is essentially what a bank write-off is. Essentially, is people defaulting on their debt, which essentially is just money disappearing. But if people weren't taking on the debt, then it's just such a joke. It's such an amateur understanding of how our economy works and how the monetary system works and how money is actually created. So I really do get a laugh out of watching what people are actually saying, and they're all just regurgitating what they've learned off each other, and you just hear the same things, and it just makes me, it really gets on my nerves when I hear people talking about yeah, we need more regulations, we need to regulate the way banks are actually, and the bonus. It's all just one big smokescreen and working on all the symptoms of a greater disease, which is really, you need to look at the money system, the way money is created, and if we don't want any debt, then we're essentially saying we don't want any money and we want a moneyless economy with the exception of the 3% that's created debt-free.
It's a paradox under the current system. If we, as the public, go into further debt, then that's going to put more money into the economy and we're going to have a boom. When you have a boom, it's easier to borrow, so people get into even more debt. And eventually, this cycle continues. It gets easier and easier to get into debt until some people get over indebted and then, they default. They can't repay their mortgage. That's what happened it happened first in subprime America. And then, that just brings to a wave of defaults which will ripple across the entire economy. The banks go insolvent, then we're into a financial crisis, and then the banks stop lending. And they were excessively lending in the boom, and then they stop lending, and then that makes the recession even worse. People lose their jobs, and then they become even more dependent on debt just to survive, basically. We have a system where we have to borrow in order to have an economy. We have to be in debt to the banks. And that guarantees, you know, a massive profit for the banks.
This is the boom-bust cycle.
And I have said before, Mr. Deputy Speaker, no return to boom and bust.
Net bank lending must forever increase.
We're paying interest on every single pound. Even if you think the money belongs to you, somebody somewhere is paying interest on that money.
The banking system has such a huge impact on the world, but only because it supplies our nation's money supply. We have to protect them, we have to subsidize them, we have to allow them to continue, because the disaster of a bank collapse affects us all in a huge way. And anyone that says that we shouldn't have bailed out the banks doesn't quite understand the nature of our monetary system. That's like eliminating a huge chunk of our money. But also, bailing out the banks is perpetuating a system which is never going to work anyway. So whatever we do, we're always going to have this cycle until we separate how money is created and the activities of banking. Then the banks can do as they wish. They're a normal business like everyone else.
There's a major democratic issue here as well. I mean, you have these private profit-seeking banks creating up to £200 billion a year and pumping that into the economy wherever they want, basically, wherever it suits them. Whether they're pumping it into, you know, these toxic derivatives or putting money into housing bubbles, just making housing more expensive. £200 billion in 2007 of new money coming into the economy, created out of nothing. And where that gets spent determines, you know, the shape of our economy, effectively. So if we're going to allow anybody to create new money out of nothing, then we should at least have some democratic control over how that money is used. I mean, would we rather have had that money used for healthcare, you know, to deal with some of the environmental issues, to reduce poverty, or would we rather have it to make houses more expensive so that none of us can afford to live in a house?
You can see it as a subsidy, a special super subsidy to the banks for the right to create money, which should be for the benefit of the public and spent through a democratic process.
There's also another form of money, which is effectively an electronic version of cash. And it's a type of money that the commercial banks use themselves to make payments between each other. The high street banks don't want to be carrying around huge quantities of money because it's dangerous and it's inconvenient and it's, you know, expensive. You have to hire security guards for that type of money. So what they do is they pay each other in what is an electronic version of cash, which in the industry is known as central bank reserves. They keep this electronic cash in accounts at the Bank of England. But as a member of the public, you can't access this electronic cash. You can't get an account with the Bank of England. What they do is they effectively sell this central bank money to the banks. And they do this by creating it out of nothing and using this money to pay for bonds, to buy bonds from the high street banks. So the high street bank will come along with a bond, which is, you know, effectively government debt. And it will give it to the Bank of England, and in return the Bank of England will type some new numbers into the bank's account at the Bank of England. So effectively they're creating central bank reserves out of nothing.
The Bank of England creates central bank reserves by increasing the available credit in the settlement bank's account with the Bank of England. The settlement bank in return posts bonds or sells assets as collateral for the reserves. A total of 46 banks hold central reserve accounts at the Bank of England. Smaller or foreign banks hold accounts with one of these 46 banks to allow them to accept or make payments in pounds sterling. Prior to March 2009, the Bank of England would ask each of the major settlement banks how much reserve currency they needed. The settlement banks would then swap a bond for the reserve currency and agree to repurchase the bond for a specific amount at a specified future date. The settlement banks would then receive interest at base or policy rate for the central bank reserves they held.